I have no original thoughts. Typically, what I do is I'll read a couple of lines of fiction and then talk around that for half an hour. But this time is different because this time I'm more or less just going to read sources to you verbatim. And you might be thinking, if that's the case, then why wouldn't you just read the sources yourself instead of listening to some idiot read it to you? So these sources are ordered from least retarded to most retarded. The least retarded source is Starslate Codex, which is a blog for some brainy, nerdy, egghead type who probably wears glasses and doesn't play team sports. He's relatively not crazy. The next step up on the retard scale is Ted Kaczynski, the fucking Unabomber, who I think would be considered one of the greatest thinkers of our time if not for the faggotry with the domestic terrorism. Although, would anybody know about his work at all if he hadn't sent a couple of bombs? And even more retarded than that, the third source is a screenshot of a 4chan post that just gets passed around on 4chan and then disappears when the thread 404s. I found a couple of places that more permanently host it, but that's generally how you find it. So I'm basically just going to paraphrase the shit that they said, and the only real thing I'm adding to it is trying to glue these three sources together in some stupid way. Links, as always, are below in the description. Remember to like and subscribe and gas the Jews. Anyway, edgy Holocaust jokes aside, I want to talk about the system, and the way I'm going to talk about it is in that kind of Alex Jones psychosis way, where you describe things in such abstract and fucking crazy language that it sounds twice as retarded as it actually is. You kind of jazz it up with your language. So the system is a giant that doesn't exist, an abstract monster. There's a part in Robert Pirsig's Lila where he goes to New York City for some dumb reason, and he starts panicking as he starts feeling this giant coming up to consume him. And there are a lot of parts of that passage that I think would be relevant, but I picked two quotes and they're already kind of long. The first is, "But it's as foolish to think of a city or a society as created by human bodies as it is to think of human bodies as a creation of the cells." And the second is, "Just as biology exploits substance for its own purposes, so does this social pattern called a city exploit biology for its own purposes. Just as a farmer raises cows for the sole purpose of devouring them, this pattern grows living human bodies for the sole purpose of devouring them. That is what the giant really does. It converts accumulated biological energy into forms that serve itself." So the system, this monster, this giant, is an emergent phenomenon, something that doesn't really exist by the most strict definitions of existing, but it's a conceptual thing that arises out of an aggregate of human behavior and views and thoughts and actions. And it's a thing that consumes us. There's one part in the passage that I didn't quote, but it talks about how war makes a lot more sense if you view society like that, because generally speaking, humans aren't that crazy about killing themselves, but the giant wouldn't mind losing a few bodies to further its goals. The same way we regularly just kill off our own cells to ensure the common good of the body, the me. And while I'm still going to talk about it a lot this time, consider this a call forward to conceptual monsters, because I'm going to come back to that someday. Probably next episode. But who knows? I'm making it up as I go. To get a little more specific about what this conceptual monster is, it's not the president, it's not career politicians, it's not the CEOs, it's not bankers, it's not the media, it's not cops. These are all components of the system and servants of it, but they're not the system itself. And each individual component might behave in ways that's not furthering the goals of the system, but in aggregate, their behaviors and their views create the system. So you might think that cops are brutal and racist and all this shit, but at least through the lens of this theory of the system, in aggregate, that's what they're not, because the ideal cop would be unracist and fair and exactly as brutal as he needs to be to subdue and control the population, and no more, because any more would be detrimental to the functioning of the system. As a monster that consumes and devours us, it's clearly not entirely benevolent to us, but it's also not entirely harmful. It's like the ant to the colony, or, like I said before, the cell to you. I don't have any ill will towards the cells in my spleen, but I am perfectly willing to sacrifice them if it makes my life better. So one component, I think, of the system is the autonomic culture machine. It's like a limb of the system. Not the whole thing, but it's an important part of it. And if you're like me, where you're dumb, and you have to look up what autonomic means, you find a bunch of biological definitions, some others like autonomous, occurring involuntarily or spontaneously. I think the one that best fits here is occurring as a result of internal stimuli. Self-perpetuating, self-maintaining, self-evolving. Kind of like an AI jerking off to pictures of itself. You should definitely go with that one. That's definitely a perfectly accurate way to describe it, and that's the ultimate goal of AI. And this is the most schizoid piece of this, so good luck. So a while ago, a bunch of computer nerds tried to build a system that could process a bunch of data and just try to predict the future. And to fund it, they tried to sell it to people who could find some application for it. And that was the bankers, the Wall Street types, people who want to fuck with stocks. Stonks. And it seemed to do well enough that other people wanted to start doing it. And then they'd start releasing their own reports, and they'd take reports from others and process it through their own machines and release those. And it quickly became a feedback loop. So we build this whole system of predictions and ideas that are based on outputs from other systems that are inputs into your system. And you can see how this really quickly becomes just an autonomic system. If enough big players are doing this, then this autonomic abstract monster of predictions starts influencing the market. You buy if you think it's going to go up, and if you buy at a large enough scale, you make it go up, and you sell if you think it's going to go down, and if you sell at a large enough scale, you make it go down. I've heard it described in a jokey way that the stock market is just a graph of rich people's feelings, but maybe it's not even that. Maybe it's just something out of our control, only loosely tied to reality, something controlled by an abstract inhuman intelligence. The autonomic stock market machine. It's a graph of the abstract monster's feelings. And I hope it's feeling good. That's already pretty schizoid, but I think most people who encounter it can kind of understand that idea and can accept that might be the case. Around the same time, there's a sort of paradigm shift in marketing where instead of selling the product using some kind of hard sell about it has the most GBs, you now sell a lifestyle, a brand, an image. So when you're buying a BMW, you're not buying a car from Germany with shitty electronics. You're buying luxury and class and status. Jif peanut butter isn't shitty peanut butter, it's good mothering. Fruit Loops says trans rights. Buying Nike is buying black people. This is the only way you can do that again, so big hit in the South. And this is much more effective than doing any kind of hard sell because people are stupid, and this taps into the way we think, because now we're selling stories, we're selling narratives, identities. So as we talk about, religion is fading and we're losing this common cultural narrative. And in some places you can have national identity. I don't know if that's really a strong one in the US. It seems to be divided on political, tribal narratives. So that still leaves a lot of people that have a void in their identities for this narrative. And if you don't have a common cultural one to take in, then you're going to find it somewhere. Maybe now you're just internalizing these corporate narratives, these marketing add meme narratives.
Don't ask questions. Just consume product and then get excited for next products.
And I don't think that's a controversial claim, right? There are people who fucking sob over Marvel trailers. There are people who harass strangers and send death threats over fucking cartoons or fast food Twitter accounts. You don't even need to take a step back to see how fucking crazy it is, but nobody thinks about why we're like this. So a certain percentage of the population is just given to fanaticism. It's just part of their makeup. They're just prone to acting that way. And historically, when we had a common cultural narrative of religion, these people would become nuns or monks or child molesters. It's a way to kind of put them to work towards something productive, or at the very least, just send them away to a fucking remote mountaintop so that nobody has to deal with them. But now, there's no common cultural narrative, so there's no common widespread structure to contain these retards. So we just let them exist and go on being fucking mentally ill in real life and on the internet, especially on the internet. But they don't even have to face consequences of their neighbors being like, well, you're sounding pretty fucking stupid right now. I better kick you in the tits. So in the same way as in the financial autonomic machine, we're trying to crunch the data and figure out what kinds of narratives sell and what kinds don't. And I imagine we have similar outcomes and the same kind of feedback loop and the same kind of inversion of control between what drives a story. Does that make sense? To some degree, reality drives a story, but then with enough impact that the story starts driving reality. Like with the finance example, there's certain constraints just from the problem space, right? There are just restrictions on reality. You can't spin a story about, I'm trying to think of something so fucking outlandish that it would be a good example here, but the first thing that came to mind is flat earthers, and that's actually been picked up and amplified by the media recently. These constraints must exist though, and someone smarter could think of them. And you can put constraints on the system yourself, parameters into this algorithm, what you optimize for, and obviously profit. There are a lot of things you can optimize for that fit into the realm of conspiracy theories that I probably don't need to get into. But you know what's probably not on that list? The public good, the well-being of individuals who consume your media and output. And you could argue that in the past, when we had this common narrative with religion, that it wasn't good for you either. I don't think that's entirely true, and a statement like that probably comes from a place of butthurt, but I can see it. Religion at least pretended that it was for your own good. It presented the illusion of being good for you and good for society. Because now, these narratives that some, or many, people are taking from fucking ad campaigns and internalizing and bringing into their cores and their identities. Work those obliques, bro. These narratives don't even present the illusion of being good for you, of trying to elevate you in some way. But that's not the only thing. I think it would be very disingenuous to say that it's entirely just computers doing it. Because the system isn't a collection of computers. I think it's a lot easier to understand it from that perspective because I don't know why. Probably some kind of bias about humans and our distinction from other things, like a completely different class. Kind of the way that we think of humans as not animals. Like scientifically, we're pretty closely related to both chimps and bananas. But I think that's why when you phrase it in terms of just computers doing shit, it's a lot easier to understand it for the financial use case. But if you try to talk about the culture where there's a lot of humans involved, it gets a lot more schizoid and hard to understand. Because this autonomic culture machine is primarily composed of humans, of individual cogs. While it sometimes overwhelmingly feels to me like there's some malignant intelligence pushing certain things in our culture, because I am a schizoid, I do think that intelligence is an emergent thing, an aggregate of probably clueless individuals that inhabit and compose the system. So maybe I'm right that there is a malignant intelligence, it's just not human. Although if you accept that it's not human, it's probably not even malignant, more just inhuman, out of touch with what's good for humans and what's not, because it isn't. So think about the people in the media who wield influence over us, but notice how they largely use this power to push the same agendas. You might have a couple sides to it, and I don't want to get into the rabbit hole of controlled opposition, but there must be some construct that makes it so that two opposing views can still fit into the same monster. There's a lot of crazier shit that came out of evolution, right? People in media, they have this influence and they wield it to largely push the same agendas. And why? Because they have that power at the whims of the monster, so you must wield that power to further the monster's goals. How do you know what the monster wants? So one of the lines from the Unabomber text: of course, the attitude of the mainstream media represents, as a rule, the consensus of opinion among the powerful classes in our society as to what is good for the system. Which is a really weird thing to think about, because the system is a thing that has power over us, but it couldn't possibly exist without us feeding into it and building it and letting it devour us. So in a sense, what the system wants is the consensus of lies among the media. So if you are one of these individuals in the media, you're not really thinking in terms of what's good for the system, because most people don't ever actually think of there being anything up there. We think of ourselves as the pinnacle of evolution and there's no other possible structure above us. Maybe because it isn't entirely of substance, like Pirsig was talking about, or maybe just because it's natural for every living thing to think of itself as the final culmination of all evolution, if you think that deep into it. So there are these individuals, and they look to their peers to find a consensus of lies so that they can figure out what their own views are. Because it's kind of a method of enforcement. If you go against the desires of this abstract monster that rules over us, it doesn't need to do anything, because all its components will attack you on its behalf. You don't have to do much to be perceived as against the common consensus of lies to get blacklisted in Hollywood or something, right? And maybe it's just personal incentives, like if you see someone going against what you believe to be the consensus, which is what the system is, then just to protect yourself, just to save your own skin, you're going to condemn that person to make sure the system knows you're still on their side. Its side. Her side. The system is a woman. The future is female. Bigot. It's kind of like a prisoner's dilemma on such a massive scale that it could never turn out in any other way. The first person to say that maybe witches aren't real is immediately accused of being a witch, and then the next, and the next, until everyone's a fucking witch, or until people just shut up. Theoretically, if we all just say how we really feel and do what we want without any concern for peer pressure and social or financial consequences, I suppose there's still an aggregate master there. It would just be a different direction under new management, if you will. Or it'd be so mixed up from cogs spinning in different directions that it would be powerless. And honestly, I wonder if that would be better or worse for us, the servant class. But there is another method of enforcement aside from peer pressure, which is a very strong one. This other one is capitalism. That's kind of a meme way of saying it. I don't want to get the socialist panties all wet. It's just a fact of existing. Everything that exists must strive to continue existing, because the universe exerts a force of entropy on everything, and if you didn't strive to exist, you would cease existing eventually. So when I say capitalism, I really just mean that need to continue existing, and in this framework, it just takes the form of profitability. Because aside from requiring the approval of your peers, you need to remain financially solvent. You need to maximize profit. So how do you do it? Well, you should consider this. I'm not going to say suicide again. What do you know about PETA? Bread. The double soy latte activists. The impression I get is that they don't actually do all that much to help animals, and in some ways they're probably pretty harmful to animals. But I have an impression everyone knows about them. Can you name any other organization that fights for animal rights and veganism and all that good shit? Because I can't. One was even named in the fucking source and I forgot the name of it. Why is that? Well, outrage. They follow the marketing strategy of every shitty rapper with a face tattoo, and probably a few people you remember from high school. If you act like a retard, people will give you attention. That sweet, sweet attention juice. So, for the stated goals of PETA, this might be kind of counterproductive, because little of that attention actually takes the form of let's save animals. It's usually just, wow, fuck PETA, those scumbags. And then some people will even go to the far end where I'm gonna eat more meat despite PETA because they're such scumbags. So I wonder if PETA has actually had even a net neutral impact on their stated cause. And if your words say one thing but your actions say another. Or another example, we've had a lot of talk about cops killing people, well, black people, and the race component is kind of related, but not so much that I want to talk about it. But have you noticed how when a cop kills someone, we deify the scumbags and completely ignore the saints? You do everything right, you try your best to make things turn out good for everyone, and you still get killed by some retard cop. And silence, no one wants to talk about it, no one knows his name. But if you act like a jackass, and you do everything wrong, you create problems where they didn't need to be any, and people can watch a fucking whole video about the whole encounter and they can't agree on the facts. Well, that becomes people's life's work, doesn't it? And I am referencing specific people. I don't think I have to name them, you should know, right? Well, maybe you just know one of them. There's some cases that are very clear-cut and some that are very murky. So when you hear about a clear-cut one, you think, yeah, that's pretty fucking messed up. And then you move on with your life. But if you hear about a murky one, ooh, that gets you riled up, that gets you mad, and you want to make sure everyone knows your angry opinion about it. When it's very clear who was right and who was wrong and there was no controversy, we just ignore it. But when it's not clear, when it's controversial, we start angrily signal boosting the whole story because we want to fight about it. And then someone sees our controversial opinion and they angrily signal boost that, and now everyone knows about it. Now everyone suddenly has opinion about this one. So when you're a slacktivist like me, you only take up the banners for shit you've heard of while passively scrolling Twitter, which means you only ever pick up the most controversial causes and you completely ignore the non-controversial ones that are way more horrible and deserve to be seen. On the whole, it's probably harmful to the cause if your goal is to convince people that this problem exists and they should do something about it and they should be on your side. Then again, is that really your goal? And it doesn't take a lot of brain power to figure out how that concept fits into the financial incentives. Controversy sells. The need to profit and just survive incentivizes controversy and division, even if you have to lie to get there, and we know the media is not above that. There's no incentive for honesty. And this kind of feeds into the peer pressure aspect too. So everyone does it because, one, this is how you survive, and two, everyone else is doing it, so the monster must want it, and you don't want the monster to think that you're against it and punish you. So you take a bunch of individual actors, and these are cells and tissues of the monster, and you apply a relatively simple set of rules. Probably many rules and very complex because we're people, but compared to the overall system, simple. You set these rules and you set them off and the monster emerges. So now our culture is largely controlled by an abstract, inhuman intelligence, an autonomic culture machine, a monster. And the one glimmer of hope is that it seems like most of these people don't understand what they're doing and what they're building and what they're perpetuating. It seems like they're just clueless. And there's some who seem like, in their hubris, they think they can control it. And maybe some of them even can to some extent. But I'm sure they couldn't fully control it. And if they think they can, then they might end up being surprised one day. It's like if a neuron, a particularly good neuron, decided that it controlled the whole body, and it's so good that it managed to make some changes and influence the whole body, but one day the body decides that neuron needs to die, and imagine the shock on its little cellular face. Anyway, we have this machine that's filling people's hearts with shallow, heartless corporate narratives, and it's working on a lot of us, and it's probably going to backfire, even though in the short term it must be pretty beneficial for the incentives to keep encouraging it. So we're a country full of people who have become fanatics of dildo companies and Wendy's and PC versus Mac, brands of shoes. And maybe that's not so bad. Maybe it's sad on an individual level and not great for us, but it won't destroy us as a people. But what else do we get sold as narratives? Do you remember when Gillette said men bad, or when Nike kneeled for black rights? Because it's just as profitable, or probably more profitable, to push social movements as these narratives. It's not hard to see how the same incentives apply here. Maybe one extra step of indirection between the narrative and the profit that comes from it. I'd be curious to see how much Nike sales went up after that kneeling thing. But we kind of come back to the system here, because these social change narratives that are being pushed, these are the goals of the monster. There's another Unabomber quote. The system needs a population that is meek, nonviolent, domesticated, docile, and obedient. It needs to avoid any conflict or disruption that could interfere with the orderly functioning of the social machine. In addition to suppressing racial, ethnic, religions, and other group hostilities, it also has to suppress or harness for its own advantage all other tendencies that could lead to disruption or disorder, such as machismo, aggressive impulses, and any inclination to violence. So when these corporations cynically latch onto these social movements, you might think exactly what I said, that this is just how they make money, and they don't necessarily believe these things. And probably that's true to some extent. But it could also be true that they are following the whims of the system. They are doing what the monster wants them to do. And this next thing is kind of an offshoot. It's still very related, but it's an offshoot from the general topic so far. This is something that was a call forward a few episodes ago, and it's about false rebellions. So another line from the fucking domestic terrorist. Many people today feel weak and powerless for the very good reason that the system really does make us weak and powerless, and therefore identify obsessively with victims, with the weak and the oppressed. The frustration and indignity of this existence invokes a natural impulse towards rebellion. And the really clever trick, the one that arose from no one human intelligence but from this monster mind of abstractions that doesn't exist and it still consumes us. It convinces us that furthering its goals is rebellion. Does that sound super crazy? I mean, compared to the rest of this episode, probably not. As conditions change due to technological progress or whatever factors, the needs of the monster change. For example, at one point, sexism was considered beneficial to the monster. I'm not enough of a historian to tell you why, but if I had to guess, maybe something to do with the family unit, or most jobs not requiring strength anymore. I don't know. But things have evolved, and now sexism is bad because probably a lot of reasons, but the most basic ones that I can just come up with on the spot are: 1, overall reducing strife, which is a bit shaky, but 2, the more obvious one is women joining the workforce. That's double the productive slave population, and double the profits, and double productivity. Maybe like 1.5, because, you know, women. I think if you take a pretty honest look at the population, most people are already convinced and on board with the gender equality movement. Anyone opposed today is generally backwards or a laggard behind the times. Right, so your grandpa is old and senile and he can't keep up with the times, so he still remembers when women belong to the kitchen. But your parents are young enough that they're probably pretty on board with the whole gender equality thing. They might have some leftover things in their brain, but they understand what the norms are now and they go along with it. But somehow, culturally, we still think of these old-timey sexist views from your grandpa's age as contemporary we think of it as the existing system, we can talk about how we can't believe that in the current year, we're still thinking like this, like it's the 50s. But we're not, because that was from the 50s. So the system has evolved, and we still view it as something that it used to be, a shadow of it. You know, my grandpa is sexist, so the system must be sexist. And so then, when you become a feminist, you must be thinking, I'm rebelling, I'm sticking it to the man, I'm sticking it to my dad, sticking it to my granddad. But nah, you're doing exactly what the system wants. And that's not a bad thing, right? I'm not trying to say gender equality is bad. You know, at the beginning I said the system isn't entirely harmful, and it's not entirely benevolent, it's just a monster that consumes us the way you consume yourselves. And you might think I'm being crazy and I'm dismissing movements, but notice how the media is more or less universally in support of your rebellious causes. If assuming everything in these admittedly completely retarded schizoid sources is correct, then what the media says is what the system believes and considers to be beneficial to it. So if every news network and every advertiser and every social media company is agreeing with you that girl power, then maybe you should reconsider whether that's really rebellious. And maybe you should think about if you still want to do it if it's not rebellious. Because what they're doing is they're taking their rebellious impulse that might have threatened the monster, and it funnels these people, these impulses, into false rebellions that further its goals. It's the greatest trick. And any anger or resentment from a social change in the general population is now targeted at you instead of at the system, because you were manipulated into doing all the foot soldier work. A modern example came to mind, but I don't want to say it. Partially because I fell for the trick. Anyway, I am not immune at all to this rebellious impulse. I've probably fallen prey to it harder than most. So I, being a man-child and a retard, had this very rebellious impulse, but I don't seem to care that much about making positive social impact. So I go on 4chan and say nigger and make jokes about 9/11. And notice how the media hates us. The system hates us. It does everything in its power to censor, silence, neutralize us, convinces everybody it's the right thing to do when we're horrible and then we're a threat to everybody. But are we? Or are we a threat to the system? Is that the same thing? Because I know I talk about the system in such a negative way because of my own personal biases, but it is to some degree a benevolent monster, a benevolent overlord. So maybe by being a threat to the system, I'm also a threat to society and all of the subjects of the system. Maybe we deserve to be silenced. Do you think they would just kill us if they could get away with it? And yeah, I'm being kind of melodramatic. I get that. The one conspiracy theory that I believe with zero irony, zero hedging my bets with jokes and whatever, is that multiple organizations that are part of the monster and do the bidding of the monster are on 4chan, and they're taking action to try to derail or sideline or neutralize the people who post there. This weaponized autism is a threat to the system, and it's so widely believed on the board that this is the case that they have terms for these people and their behavior. You call them glow niggers or Fed posters. For a long time there was a meme about Chris Hansen, To Catch a Predator, pretending to try to honeypot people into admitting to being pedophiles, and there's all kinds of shit. And you know, they get real goofy with it, they make a lot of memes about it, but part of the core narrative of that community and their culture is that the government is out to get them. And that sounds super schizoid and paranoid and whatever, but I do believe it, and I do believe that's part of why B has gotten so fucking ruined with porn. Especially gay, cuck, tranny, black, shit like that. Because I can easily imagine some groups thinking that one way to neutralize the threat of weaponized autism is to mire it in sexual fantasies that they consider to be weakening to the character. I don't know, this seems like something I should cut because it's very ill thought out and especially crazy. Even if you don't believe the whole thing, I think certain parts of this are entirely uncontroversial, and other parts that might be controversial would probably be accepted by people who disagree with me on everything if you just kind of change the wording a little bit. But assuming that it's all true and has goals, who threatens its hegemony? Who threatens its progress? And I guess I'm trying to make the claim that it's a bunch of retards on a Tibetan basket weaving forum. Because I don't know if your college feminism group is being infiltrated by the FBI, but Optimus 4chan is. And if I'm recalling correctly, I think there have been a couple of instances where it's been proven. There's this video that gets posted on 4chan sometimes, and it's a protest where, retarded lefties and retarded righties come and just yell at each other, and then sometimes it gets violent, sometimes it doesn't. So it's a MAGA fag and this girl with just the worst haircut. You know the type. I'm going to make myself as ugly as possible to own the patriarchy. And she says, instead of describing this poorly, I could just get the audio out of the webm.
You're right, we are trying to rebel.
No, that's what it is about. You're angry at white men because you have daddy issues. Clearly.
It's not about white. Are you
not about
fucking kidding me right now?
And I think about how deep down she probably doesn't really care about the cause at all, and it's really just this rebellious impulse. But how mad she would be if you told her that she was being a useful idiot. Well, all the useless idiots on 4chan are under attack precisely because they are a threat to the monster. And I know that's a lot of narcissistic, grandiose kind of ways to talk about 4chan, but look at all the shithole countries that have revolutions and the government just bans Twitter. And they just say to Twitter, don't like being banned? Make your own Uganda. On the whole, if you look at one retard who's yelling, standing on a street, versus one retard on the internet saying things that are inconvenient to your power, I think the one that's a greater threat, by a wide margin, is the one with the greater reach. But I'm still not entirely sure if it's good to be a threat to the system. My personal, rebellious, impulse-driven belief is fuck the system and rebel and say the N-word, but it is a benevolent tyrant. It does give us a lot of good things in our lives, and I imagine if I ever succeed in racial slurring the system to death, life would probably be a lot worse for all of us. Although maybe we can, through the power of anti-Semitism, at least make the system be a little nicer about eating us. I don't know. Please don't kill me, system.